In the autumn of 1871, the Great Chicago Fire destroyed thousands of buildings, killed over 300 people, and left 90,000 residents homeless. The city needed lumber to rebuild. Almost all of that lumber came from one place, a small port town on the eastern shore of Lake Michigan called Singapore. For 2 years, Singapore's 3 sawmills ran around the clock, stripping the forests of the surrounding Allegan County to feed Chicago's reconstruction. By 1873, the forests were gone. By 1875, the wind that the forests had blocked began to whip sand off the Lake Michigan dunes onto the buildings of the town. The sand kept coming. Buildings were buried first by their foundations, then their first floors, then their second floors. By the 1880s, Singapore was gone. The town that helped save Chicago was buried under the dunes of the lake that made it possible. That is one Michigan ghost town. The state has at least 9 more whose endings are equally strange. These are the 10 that quietly disappeared. Before we get into it, like this video and drop your town and the time you are watching in the comments. I want to see where everyone is tuning in from. And number 3 on this list is one I bet most people in Michigan have no idea exists. Stick around. Also, do you know that there are places in America you're not supposed to know about? Towns where the ground has been on fire for 60 years. Asylums that locked people in and never let them out. Military sites the government still won't explain. I put 50 of them into one free ebook, the history, the legends, the places you can actually visit, and the ones you can't. Link in the comments section before I take it down. All right, let's get into it. Number 10. Central Mine. In the late 1850s, on the spine of the Keweenaw Peninsula in the far north of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, prospectors looking for copper discovered something extraordinary. A vein of native copper running directly through the rock at the surface. Pure metal, no smelting required, the kind of deposit that mining engineers had only seen in maps from ancient Roman texts. The Central Mining Company was incorporated in 1854. By the 1860s, the town of Central Mine had over 1,200 residents, a school, a Methodist church, company houses arranged in tidy rows along the ridge, and one of the most productive copper mines in the world. The Cornish miners who worked Central Mine had brought their skills from the tin mines of Cornwall, England. They worked 12-hour shifts in shafts that descended over 1,000 feet into the rock. The mine captain's house sat at the top of the hill, watching over the workers' cottages below. On Sundays, the entire community climbed the hill to the Methodist church for the morning service, and 100 years later their descendants still gather there once a year. On the 3rd Sunday of July for an annual reunion that began in 1907, and has never been canceled. The copper ran out in 1898. The mine closed. The Cornish miners left, taking their skills to the next mine, or to Butte, Montana, or to the new copper deposits of Arizona. Some stayed, most did not. By 1910, Central Mine was a ghost, but the church is still there. The stone foundations of the mine captain's house are still there. The cemetery, which holds miners who died in their 30s of silicosis and accident and the fevers of a town that the company doctor could not always save, is still there. And once a year on the 3rd Sunday of July, the descendants come back. They sing the old hymns, they walk the same paths their great-great-grandfathers walked to work, and then they leave again and the town returns to the forest until next July. A town that died over 100 years ago and refuses to stay dead for one Sunday a year. Number 9. Cliff. 20 miles south of Central Mine, also on the Keweenaw Peninsula, there is a place called Cliff. It was the first major copper mining operation in the Keweenaw, and for a brief period in the 1850s, it was the richest copper mine in the United States. The town that grew up around it, called Clifton or sometimes just Cliff, had over 1,000 residents at its peak. 2 churches, a school, a hotel, and the kind of frontier saloons that Cornish, Irish, and Finnish miners filled every Saturday night. The Cliff Mine was discovered in 1845 by a geologist named John Hayes, who noticed a sheet of native copper exposed on the face of a basalt cliff. The copper ran in veins that the miners followed deeper and deeper into the rock. At its peak, the Cliff Mine produced over 38 million pounds of refined copper. Some of the masses of native copper extracted from the mine weighed more than 50 tons. One specimen, on display today at the Michigan Tech Mineral Museum in Houghton, is so large it had to be cut into pieces just to be removed from the shaft. The wealth that the Cliff Mine generated transformed the Keweenaw. Investors in Boston and New York made fortunes. The mining company built infrastructure across the peninsula. Workers came from Cornwall, Ireland, Italy, and Finland, attracted by wages that were higher than almost any other industrial work in the country. By the 1870s, the rich veins were exhausted. The mine closed. The workers moved on to Calumet, to Hancock, to the newer mines further south. The town of Clifton emptied within a decade. By 1890, the church was empty. By 1900, the school was closed. By the 1920s, the buildings had been salvaged for lumber or had collapsed entirely. What remains is the cliff itself, an exposed basalt face 50 feet high, and a cemetery up the hill with the graves of the miners who died here. The town that started Michigan's copper boom is now a parking lot, a trail, and a few stone foundations in the forest. The first place to make the Keweenaw rich is now the first place the Keweenaw forgot. Number 8. Arrol. On a quiet stretch of Lake Michigan shoreline in Benzie County, about 90 miles north of Grand Rapids, there is a Sleeping Bear Dunes parking lot with a Park Service sign that explains in restrained federal prose that this used to be a town called Aral. The sign does not fully convey what happened here on August 10, 1889. The town was founded in the early 1880s as a lumber community. By 1886, it had a sawmill, a school, a general store, a boarding house, and a population of around 200 people. The mill was managed by a man named Charles T., 6 feet 2 inches tall, 200 pounds, originally from Wisconsin. He was good at running a sawmill. He was also quick-tempered, carried a gun, and once boasted that he could put 5 bullets through a man's hat before the man knew what was happening. In 1889, Wright refused to pay his taxes. The county had increased the rates beyond what he considered reasonable. After repeated notices, Benzie County Deputy Sheriff Neil Marshall arrived at the mill on August 10th with the local doctor, Frank Thurber, to serve a writ. There was an argument. Wright went into the mill office, came back with a rifle, and shot Marshall dead. Thurber wrestled the rifle away from him. Wright pulled a revolver from his pocket and shot Thurber in the head and in the chest. Both men were dead before noon. Wright walked back to the mill, told the workers to keep cutting, and continued his shift as if nothing had happened. When news of the murders reached the county seat, a posse of 20 men was raised from Benzonia and Beulah. Wright had already fled into the woods. The posse arrived at Arrol, found Wright's Native American interpreter, a man named Peter Lahala, and demanded to know where Wright was hiding. When Lahala refused, the posse hanged him by the neck from a tall pine tree in the center of town. They told him to kick his legs if he wanted to talk. Before he died, members of the posse emerged from the woods with Wright in custody, and Lahala was cut down. Wright was convicted of 2 counts of murder and sent to Jackson State Prison for life. He served 10 years and was released. The mill burned down in 1899. The town held on briefly under a religious commune called the Israelite House of David, which was famous for its bearded baseball team. The commune left when the timber ran out. The Bancroft family stayed until 1922. After that, nobody. The hanging tree is still there. A federal sign explains the rest. Sticking with us so far? Good, because the next 3 entries get genuinely strange. Number 5 involves a religious cult. Number 4 was built and abandoned by the terms of one man's will. Stay with us. Number 7, Nonesuch. In the Porcupine Mountains in the western corner of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, there is a copper mine called Nonesuch. The mine got its name from a vein of copper that, according to local legend, was so unusual it had no equal anywhere else. The vein was indeed unusual. The copper was bound up in a kind of conglomerate rock that made it extremely difficult to refine using 19th century technology. The Nonesuch mine, opened in 1867, struggled to extract its copper profitably for decades. The town that grew up around the mine was built in a narrow valley between forested ridges. At its peak, it had around 300 residents, a company store, a school, and the kind of isolated frontier life that characterized most of the Porcupine Mountains in the late 19th century. The closest town of any size was Ontonagon, 20 miles away over rough roads. What killed Nonesuch was not just the difficulty of refining the copper. It was the geography. The town was buried in winter. Snow piled up to the eaves of the houses. Supplies could not reach the community for weeks at a time. Workers grew sick from a combination of cold, isolation, and the dust of the mine. The Nonesuch Mining Company tried multiple times to make the operation profitable. They tried new refining techniques. They tried importing experts from Britain and Germany. Nothing worked at scale. The mine closed for good in 1912. The town emptied within a few years. The buildings were either dismantled for materials or left to collapse under the snow. The Porcupine Mountains were eventually protected as Michigan's largest state park, and the site of Nonesuch became a stop on a hiking trail. Today, you can hike to the ruins from the Lake of the Clouds parking area. The walk is about 2 miles through dense hardwood forest. When you arrive, what remains is a series of stone foundations, the rusted remains of mining equipment, and a small clearing that used to be the town square. The forest has reclaimed almost everything else, a copper mine that nobody could quite figure out, in a valley nobody could quite reach, abandoned because the weather was always going to win. Number 6. Mandan. At the end of a dirt road in the Garden Peninsula, past the village of Copper Harbor, past the lighthouse at the very tip of Michigan, there is a place called Mandan. It is sometimes called the end of the road, because the road literally ends there. Beyond Mandan is forest and water and, eventually, Lake Superior. There is no continuing route. Mandan was a copper mining town established in the 1860s. At its peak, it had several hundred residents, a school, a church, and the same Cornish mining community that populated most of the Keweenaw mines. What made Mandan distinct was its isolation. It was the most northern, the most remote, and the most weather-exposed of the Keweenaw mining towns. Winter storms off Lake Superior buried the town under snow that did not fully melt until June. Supplies arrived by ship in summer and by sled in winter, when the ice on Lake Superior allowed. The mine closed in the 1870s after a relatively short period of operation. The town held on for a few decades, supported by a small fishing economy and the diminished mining work in the area. By the 1920s, Mandan was effectively empty. What remains today is one of the most evocative ghost town sites in Michigan. A few abandoned company houses are still standing, their wooden frames weathered gray by over a century of Lake Superior weather. The foundations of the mining buildings are visible in the forest. The cemetery, small and overgrown, holds the graves of Cornish miners who died here in the 1860s, and whose families never returned to claim them. The reason most people have never heard of Mandan is the same reason it died. You cannot easily get there. The dirt road that leads to it is barely maintained. There is no signage in the village of Copper Harbor pointing you toward Mandan. Locals will tell you about it if you ask, but they will also tell you to bring water, fuel, and a vehicle you do not mind scratching. The end of the road, at the end of the peninsula, at the top of the state. Mandan does not appear on most maps for a reason. Number 5. Pere Cheney. About 10 miles southeast of Grayling in the center of Michigan's Lower Peninsula, there is a small dirt road that ends at a cemetery in a clearing in the Huron National Forest. The cemetery holds approximately 90 graves. There are no buildings nearby, no houses, no signs except a single Park Service marker. This is all that remains of Pere Cheney, a town that lost its population to disease, fire, and a curse, depending on whom you believe. George Cheney founded the town in 1874 after receiving a land grant from the Michigan Central Railroad. The line ran a stop here for the convenience of the lumber industry. Within a few years, the town had a sawmill, a hotel, a general store, a post office, and a population that climbed to roughly 1,500 people. It was one of the largest communities in the region. In 1893, a diphtheria outbreak swept through the town. Diphtheria is a bacterial infection of the throat and nose that kills mostly children by closing the airways. In an era before antibiotics or widely available vaccines, an outbreak in a small isolated community was catastrophic. The cemetery filled faster than it could be tended. Whole families lost all of their children. Some lost all of their adults. The graves dated to that year include many small markers, often with multiple names from the same family. Then came the fires. A series of blazes in the mid-1890s destroyed much of the town. The official explanation was sparks from the sawmills. The rumor, which spread quickly and has never quite died, was that residents of neighboring towns, terrified that the diphtheria would spread to their own communities, deliberately set fire to Pere Cheney to drive the survivors out and burn the contagion. In 1897, the diphtheria returned. By 1901, the population had dropped to 25. By 1917, the population was under 20, and the remaining land was sold in a public auction. The town was over. What remains is the cemetery. The trees around it are twisted. The ground is mostly bare. Visitors have reported handprints on their cars, lights without sources, the laughter of children with no children present. Local legend says a woman was hanged from a tree in the cemetery, accused of being the witch who cursed the town with the disease. The historical record contains no evidence of this. The cemetery is real. The dead children are real. Whatever else is there, the truth is bad enough. A town that lost its children twice and then lost everything else. Number 4. Deward. In Crawford and Otsego counties, in the northern lower peninsula of Michigan, there is a tract of state forest land called the Deward Forest. The name does not refer to a topographic feature. It refers to a town that was built between 1901 and 1912, then abandoned according to the explicit terms of a dead man's will. The man was David Ward. He was a lumber baron born in 1804 in New York, who came to Michigan in the 1830s and built one of the largest timber empires in the state. By the 1880s, he owned over 90,000 acres of pine forest in northern Michigan, much of it virgin white pine, the most valuable timber species in North America. Ward was famously eccentric, frugal, and shrewd. He kept his money in a vault in his house. He distrusted banks. He distrusted most other people. And when he died in 1890, he left specific instructions in his will about what was to be done with his forest. The instructions were clear. His timber holdings were to be logged. A town was to be built specifically to house the workers who would cut the trees. The town was to operate for exactly 10 years after the start of commercial logging, beginning when the heirs were ready. At the end of 10 years, the logging was to stop, the workers were to be dismissed, the town was to be closed, and the land was to be transferred to the state. The heirs honored the will. In 1901, a logging crew arrived at the site. They built a town from scratch: sawmills, boarding houses, a school, a company store, a post office, and rows of company housing for the workers and their families. The town was named Deward after the deceased. Within a year, 300 people lived there. Within 5 years, the population was over 800. For 10 years, the town did exactly what it had been built to do. The white pine forests of David Ward's holdings were cut, milled, and shipped out by rail. The workers cut hard, drank hard, and saved what they could. At the end of 1911, the timber was exhausted on schedule. In 1912, the town was closed on schedule. The workers packed up and left. The sawmills were dismantled. The houses were either moved or salvaged. The land was transferred to the state of Michigan as Ward had specified. The town that had existed for exactly 10 years, by the precise terms of a will written over a decade before it was founded, ceased to exist. Today, the Deward Forest is a state forest. The town site is marked by stone foundations and a single information sign. A town born and killed entirely on schedule by the terms of one man's will. Number 3. Pequaming. On a small peninsula on the south shore of Lake Superior, about 30 miles east of Houghton, there is a community called Pequaming. It was, for a brief period in the early 20th century, one of the most carefully designed company towns in the United States. The man who designed it was Henry Ford. Ford did not invent Pequaming. The town had existed since the 1870s as a lumber community owned by the Hebard family, who ran a sawmill at the end of the peninsula. By the 1920s, the Hebard operation was struggling. In 1923, Ford bought the entire town: sawmill, houses, store, school, every building. He paid roughly $700,000 for the lot. Ford had been buying up timber operations across the Upper Peninsula. He needed lumber for the wooden body panels of his Model T automobiles. He decided that Pequaming would not just be a lumber town for the Ford Motor Company. It would be a model community. He renovated every house in the town and painted them all the same color, a specific shade of bright white with green trim. He built a new schoolhouse. He renovated the sawmill with modern equipment. He installed running water and electricity in every home, which was extraordinary for a remote Upper Peninsula community in the 1920s. He also installed Ford rules: no alcohol, no swearing in public. Workers were expected to attend church on Sundays. Their wives were expected to maintain household standards that Ford's sociological department, the same group that investigated his Detroit workers' home lives, would have approved of. The town's residents could not unionize. Ford did not allow it. Pequaming operated as a Ford company town for nearly 30 years. Workers loved it for the housing quality and the wages, which were above industry standard. They hated it for the surveillance and the paternalism. By the 1950s, Ford had divested most of his Upper Peninsula timber holdings. The Pequaming sawmill was sold and eventually closed. The town emptied. The white houses with green trim slowly faded and weathered and were sold to private buyers, many of whom kept them as summer cottages. Today, Pequaming is a quiet residential community of fewer than 100 year-round residents. The sawmill is gone. The store is closed. A few of the original white and green houses are still standing, recognizable to anyone who knows the Ford color scheme. Henry Ford built a utopia, made everyone wear white, and then sold it when it was no longer profitable. Number 2. Singapore. At the mouth of the Kalamazoo River, on the eastern shore of Lake Michigan, just north of present-day Saugatuck, there used to be a port town called Singapore. It was founded in 1836 by New York land speculators who believed that this stretch of Lake Michigan coast would become a major Great Lakes port, rivaling Chicago and Milwaukee. They were wrong about that, but they were not wrong that Singapore would become important. For a brief period in the mid-19th century, it was. Singapore had 3 sawmills, 2 hotels, several general stores, a renowned wildcat bank that issued its own currency, a population of several hundred, and a position at the mouth of the Kalamazoo River that gave it access to vast tracts of inland white pine forest. The lumber that flowed out of Singapore went to Chicago, Milwaukee, and the growing cities of the Midwest. By the 1860s, the town was prosperous and growing. Then came 1871. In October of that year, 4 catastrophic fires struck the Great Lakes region within hours of each other. The Great Chicago Fire killed 300 people and left 90,000 homeless. The Peshtigo Fire in Wisconsin killed over 1,500. Fires also struck Holland, Michigan, and Manistee, Michigan. The total devastation across the region was massive. And all of those cities needed lumber to rebuild. Immediately. Singapore stepped up. Its sawmills ran around the clock for 2 years, stripping the forests around the Kalamazoo River to feed Chicago's reconstruction. By 1873, the forests within reach of Singapore were largely gone. The trees that had grown for hundreds of years were now buildings in Chicago. But the trees had been doing something else too. They had been blocking the wind off Lake Michigan from carrying sand inland from the dunes. Without the trees, the wind had nothing to stop it. By the mid-1870s, sand began to drift into Singapore. Streets filled first, then doorways, then first floors of buildings, then second floors. Local legend tells of one stubborn resident who refused to leave, climbing higher and higher in his 3-story house as the sand rose, exiting through upper windows until finally the sand reached the roof and he gave up. By the 1880s, Singapore was gone. Most buildings were salvaged and floated down the Kalamazoo to Saugatuck on barges. What could not be moved was abandoned and buried. By the early 20th century, no trace remained on the surface. Today, the site of Singapore is privately owned land just north of Saugatuck. It cannot be legally visited on foot without permission, but the dunes are still there. The sand is still moving. And somewhere beneath those dunes, archaeologists believe, the timber frames of 19th century buildings are still preserved, dry and intact, waiting to be excavated if anyone ever decides it is worth doing. A town that helped save Chicago then was buried by the lake that made the trade possible. And number 1, Fayette, on the Garden Peninsula, a thin finger of land jutting south into Lake Michigan from Michigan's Upper Peninsula, there is a natural harbor called Snail Shell Harbor. It is named for its curved shape, which provides shelter from Lake Michigan storms. White limestone cliffs rise from the water around the harbor. The forest comes down to the shoreline, and on the western side of the harbor, on the limestone bluff, stand the preserved remains of one of the best preserved ghost towns in the United States. The town is Fayette. It was founded in 1867 by the Jackson Iron Company of Cleveland, Ohio. The company's general manager, a man named Fayette Brown, had identified the location as ideal for an iron smelting operation. The harbor could ship raw materials in and finished pig iron out. The limestone cliffs provided flux to purify the iron during smelting. The surrounding hardwood forests provided the wood that would be burned into charcoal to fuel the blast furnaces. Every ingredient the smelting process required was within walking distance. Within months, Fayette had 2 enormous blast furnaces, a charcoal kiln complex, a machine shop, a hotel, a company store, a school, and rows of housing for the workers and their families. By the 1870s, the town had nearly 500 residents, most of them immigrants from Canada, Finland, Norway, and other parts of Europe. They worked the furnaces, chopped the wood, burned the charcoal, and operated the machinery that produced pig iron for the steel mills of the lower Great Lakes. The town had a cornet band, a baseball team, a horse racing track, an opera house, and the kind of self-sufficient industrial culture that defined company towns of the era. The Jackson Iron Company controlled almost everything: the housing, the store, the doctor, the pay scale, the rules of conduct. Workers were paid monthly, with deductions for store debts, medical fees, and any other charges the company chose to assess. A coal forker named Trout Doogie earned $44.80 for 28 days of work in 1878 and took home $18.28 after the company's deductions. By 1891, the operation was no longer profitable. The hardwoods within reach of Fayette had been exhausted, and newer steelmaking technologies in the East were making the pig iron Fayette produced obsolete. The Jackson Iron Company closed the operation. The furnaces went cold. The workers moved on. Most of the town emptied within a year. About 20 residents stayed behind, adapting to fishing and farming. In 1959, the state of Michigan purchased the site and turned it into Fayette Historic State Park. The state has preserved nearly 20 buildings in their original condition. The blast furnaces still stand, partially intact. The company store still has its counter. The hotel still has its dining room. The opera house still has its stage. Visitors can walk through what was, for 2.5 decades, one of the most productive iron-making communities in the country. What makes Fayette extraordinary is not just the preservation, it is the silence. The blast furnaces that defined the soundscape of the town for 24 years have been silent for over a century. The harbor that ferried millions of tons of material in and out is now used by recreational boats. The opera house that hosted traveling performers does not hear music anymore. The schools have no children, the houses have no families. The most productive town on the Garden Peninsula is now its emptiest. You can stand inside the workers' cottages and see exactly where the families lived. You can stand at the harbor and see exactly where the ships docked. You can stand at the base of the blast furnaces and look up at structures that produced 230,000 tons of pig iron and now produce nothing at all. A town that did everything it was built to do, then quietly stopped and refused to fall apart. Michigan's ghost towns died the same way most ghost towns die. The lumber ran out, the copper played out, the iron stopped being profitable, the railroad rerouted, the disease swept through, the sand moved in, the will expired. The Henry Ford project ended. But what Michigan has in unusual abundance is the evidence. Hundreds of these towns are still findable, in the forests and along the back roads and at the ends of dirt tracks that nobody maintains anymore. Foundations in the woods, cemeteries with no churches, post office addresses that no longer exist, houses that nobody has lived in for over 100 years. The state has more ghost towns than almost any other east of the Mississippi River, and most of them are not on any tourist map. They sit where they sat when their last residents left. The forest closes over them. The lake erodes them. The snow buries them. And every once in a while, someone drives down a dirt road, sees a foundation in the trees, and realizes that something used to be here. That is most of Michigan, if you know where to look. If you found this video as strange as I did, subscribing takes 1 second, and it helps us keep making these. Thanks for watching. Every video I put out takes real time and effort, and delivering quality content to you will always be my priority. If you would like to support my channel, even something as simple as buying me a coffee goes a long way. Just scan the QR code on your screen or click the link in the comment section of this video. It may seem small, but it truly means the world to me. Thank you, and see you in the next video.